establishing a territorial control is most of all a matter of controlling networks. I mean, that's not something new. It's not something new. I mean, for thousands of years, when you want to occupy a territory, you firstly occupy the networks that shape this territory. For example, the railroad system, the road system, but also the physical networks, such as the political networks, the information networks, power networks, etc., etc.
Hello, Kevin, and thank you for joining us. I believe we already established a list of questions, so I'm going to begin with the first one. What is your vision of OSINT? Like, how do you envision it in the context of geopolitics?
Well, that's a good question. As a geographer, I'm interested in understanding the physical world, and I'm interested in mapping it. And for me, OSINT, open source intelligence, is a set of tools that can be used and mobilized in order to understand how, power shapes some territories. And we perfectly see that in Ukraine today, when we have a lot of OSINT communities trying to, for example, identify some war criminals, or trying to identify which Russian regiment did this or did that, which Wagner group soldier killed somebody, etc. And all these investigations are very useful in order to understand geopolitical conflicts today. I mean, we are in deeply digitalized societies where almost nothing happens without the intermediation of a smartphone, a computer, or a digital thing, such like this one. And almost every of these intermediation actions do generate digital footprints. And these digital footprints, some of them, of course, are open source. Most of them are not open source. But harvesting them, trying to understand them, cross them, can help you to have a better view of a geopolitical situation, because there is no geopolitical situation in 2022 that do not generate digital footprints. So basically, it's a very important tool today for geopolitics. I mean, OSINT.
Okay, and would you describe a little bit your work, what you do, and how OSINT got into the way of your work, how you use OSINT in your work?
Okay, so at the very beginning, I was, as I said, I'm a geography specialist of working on Russia. And at the very beginning, I was writing my PhD dissertation in geography about the topic was former Soviet closed and secret cities that were opened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I studied how these cities did open, did survive or not, to the shock therapy, to the conversion to the capitalist system, etc. And I lived in some of these cities for almost a year. And when I was there, I discovered a lot of very interesting things about the Russian internet, and the fact, for example, that in some of these cities, you did have not one, but two digital networks, two networks. The first one was the global internet, and the second one was a kind of local, a kind of local network at the size of the city, and I was very astonished by this discovery, because this is something that do not exist in Western Europe and in France. And this is how I met with a lot of Russian people, programmers, hackers, etc. And this is when I did perceive that the structure of the Russian internet was quite unique, I mean, worldwide. And it was more than 10 years ago now. It was in 2011, 2012. And back then, I decided to focus my research on understanding this architecture, understanding what geopolitical consequences it has, and how these actors investigate this network. And this is basically how I used for the first time digital footprints, and trying to cross them, to analyze them in something that nobody back then would call OSINT. I mean, OSINT was something that was non-existent back then, but a lot of people like me did that without understanding what we were doing back then, because everything changed during the 10 last years, when we realized that digital investigation was not only a hobby for geek people, it was a real way of understanding informations and collecting information that were not supposed to be public. And we know that it is now a very important topic regarding investigation journalism, but also regarding geopolitics, when you have people like Navalny being able to identify the guys who poisoned him just by doing some kind of basic OSINT. That's something that is quite interesting, I would say.
And do you think the role of OSINT can sometimes? Do you think sometimes OSINT can be used for a political leverage? We've seen, the investigation of the New York Times presenting what happened in Bucha. You just talked about Navalny and the people that tried at least to poison him. How do you think this is going to be used when employed by states? How is it going to be inserted in global geopolitical context?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, maybe that's something I forgot to say. But what is geopolitics? Basically, geopolitics is the scientific methodology used to understand how some groups, it could be states, non-state actors, terrorists, whatever you want, do establish a territorial control on a given surface of the Earth. And establishing a territorial control is most of all a matter of controlling networks. I mean, that's not something new. It's not something new. I mean, for thousands of years, when you want to occupy a territory, you firstly occupy the networks that shape this territory. For example, the railroad system, the road system, but also the physical networks, such as the political networks, the information networks, power networks, etc., etc. So basically, everything in geopolitics, almost everything in geopolitics, is a matter of controlling or not controlling networks. But the new thing today with the digital revolution is that most of these networks are at some points digitalized. I mean, political networks, information networks, that's quite obvious with social networks, etc., etc. But also, I would say physical networks are in partially digitalized. There is no power grid working, for example, without computer science today. At least in Europe. So, and all these networks that are digitalized do produce, and all the activity of these networks produce some information. And these information, these digital footprints, can be of use not only for understanding what is happening on the ground, like we see in Ukraine, but also to highlight how a given actor is either losing ground, either winning ground. We see today that digital investigation is very important to point to the crimes that are being today committed by the Russians in Ukraine. So this is something of a very important political significance, because now you are able, I would say, to establish a regime of truth by demonstrating who is guilty of what, and in order to also say who is successful and who is not. And we can see today that, for example, networks such as Telegram, you have a real war between, I would say, collectives and peoples doing OSINT supporting Ukraine on one hand, and on the other hand, people doing the same but for the Russians. And everybody is pushing his narrative, is pushing his own interpretation of sometimes the same facts. And so this is a new way of telling who is right and who is not right. And this is something deeply political, but this is also a danger for, I would say, democratic processes and so on, because OSINT interpretation can be very objective, but sometimes it is so technical, and the technicity is so, I would say, pronounced that it is a problem for bringing it to a wider audience. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good thing that you bring that up, because I've heard several people, especially journalists, saying that OSINT is a very interesting thing for them, because since the information is public, they can give it to anyone, and anyone can go and check this information.
Mhm.
It's not a matter of, oh, I have this source that told me, and trust me, it is a true story, you can trust me. This information is absolutely public, so it would end a little bit that age of, is which media is saying the truth or not. But it's a good thing that you're kind of balancing that affirmation with the fact that sometimes these investigations are very complex and very technical. Not everybody can understand or replicate them.
Or replicate. This is something important, because I mean, the internet is moving and evolving at every second, and some IP address or anything can be one thing on one day and another thing the other day. So there is a real question of reproducibility of all of that, and this is also a juridical question, because we did not talk about that, but at the political level. All these digital footprints produced by captors, by machines in the environment, translating some parts of reality in digital bits. I think about smartphones, for example. That's basically what they do. All these pictures, all these GPS tracks, all these social media posts, and whatever you want. For example, documenting the Bucha massacre, how all these proofs will be used by, I hope, a international criminal court when the time will come to judge the people who are responsible for killing these innocent civilians. And when this war will be over, because it will be one day, and I hope that we will be able to judge these people, and OSINT and digital footprints will be at the forefront for demonstrating the guilt of these people. But there are a lot of juridical questions. How do you use it if it's not if there is no reproducibility, of the process, if the proof did vanish or whatever? that's why we are not at a moment when the OSINT community, and I'm talking from the academic point of view, but I think that's the same for journalists or NGOs. OSINT community needs some basic common standards, for example, to establish a common ground in order to raise best practices, etc. And I know that some organizations are now working on such best practices, which is a very good thing, because if we don't do that, the juridical relevance of such process will be questionable.
Yeah, to come back quickly to the OSINT, needing some guidelines and needing to become an established player in this kind of processes. I believe that's the case in every, let's say, new community, as it was the case with cybersecurity 30 years ago. It was not at the stage of professionalization as it is now. So I would believe, and I don't know if you will agree with me, that time will tell. Hopefully, we'll get all in line. But I wanted to talk a little bit more. We brushed on the subject very quickly about the limits of OSINT. I believe when I met you for the first time, we got talking like OSINT is very nice tool, great, but and I would like to rehear your opinion of the matter on the matter.
Well, the limits are numerous. From my perspective as a researcher, one of the first, well, it depends what you do with OSINT, but if you want to understand a full complex situation, OSINT can be very limitative, because you are only given to see what the data allows you to see. So OSINT per se is not enough for understanding a complex situation. It can be very useful for designating who is guilty of what, or following money or whatsoever. But for understanding the bigger picture, the context, why somebody is doing what he is doing, you need to have a deeper knowledge of the field you are investigating. And for example, regarding OSINT, when it about not speaking Russian or not understanding Russian history, or how some parts of the Russian elite are actually thinking. It is a big limitation of what you can do with OSINT. So this is not a limit of OSINT per se, but this is a limit of what you can do with OSINT. Now, I think that the limits of OSINT are evolving also, because we lived through a golden age of these kind of digital investigation processes in the last 10 years, because nobody was really noticing what the OSINT investigators were doing. And they were, for example, Bellingcat was able to do what they did principally because nobody noticed that it was important. But now, with the war in Ukraine, OSINT became something trendy and something that almost everybody heard of. So we see that more and more digital services platforms are closing, APIs are closing what was the core of digital investigation. This is one of the first limit. And another big limit is that some huge parts of the internet are more and more difficult to access. For example, the Russian part of the internet, what we call the Runet, was for a very long time a kind of paradise for OSINTers, because Putin's Russia is obsessed with digital control. and produce a lot of digital footprints of everything, but it's also a deeply corrupted country. So the convergence of these two facts do produce something that is quite amazing, which is a huge amount of data available on the black market, because the corrupted system encouraged the fact that all these data produced by digital control can be sold on black markets. And that's basically how Navalny was able to identify the FSB agents trying to poison him. And now all these things are changing more and more, because a lot of databases that were very useful, for example, for understanding public contracts in Russia, are closing. They are closing because, communication between Russia and the Western world is becoming more and more difficult. Filtration of traffic is tighter and tighter. We don't know, maybe in some years from now, the Russians will be able to filtrate even the VPN traffic. So that will be a huge problem when you will want to harvest and collect data from Russia, for example. But the same thing could be said about countries such as China or Iran. Authoritarian countries love to control their networks, and they love to control their internet. Now they do have the technological ability to go much further in digital control, even if the Chinese internet is very deeply controlled by design from the beginning. But now there is more and more means to control these the digital networks, and it will be even more difficult to collect data. This is, in my opinion, one of the future limits I see for using OSINT, where it is really useful. For pointing out abuses from authoritarian countries, for example, corruption facts, and all these sort of things. I think that golden age is now belonging to the past. And now we are entering something that is a kind of cat and mouse game where, like for hacking, actually.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, especially with regulations coming along, the RGPD coming along, kind of making it more complicated for us. I guess the good news for us is that people will always make mistakes. They will always have like a Russian cyber criminal posting pictures on Instagram that he's on vacation in Palma de Mallorca and getting busted like this. So yeah, I hope we still have that for us going in next years. But you talked about the Russian internet becoming more and more opaque, more and more closed.
Mhm.
Would you care to elaborate on this? Like, what are some concrete evolution that you saw, and when did that trend start?
Well, for a decade now, the Russian regime try to control the internet. Before 2011, 2010, internet was not something that was interesting for the guys in power in Russia, because they are what we call siloviki in Russian, people from the former organs of security, defense. Internet and new technology, it was not part of their world. That was something that was completely outside of their preoccupations and their political scope. But in 2011, things began to change. Why? Because Russia back then was in a big turmoil, I would say. Let's remember that back then, the biggest demonstrations that were organized in Russia did happen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And these demonstrations that brought tens or hundreds of thousands of people on the streets, I mean, that was something completely huge, were organized in order to protest against the fact that Vladimir Putin, who was still the prime minister back then, and Medvedev was president of the federation, and these demonstrations were for protesting against the fact that Putin wanted to come back to power as president for a third term. And these demonstrations, and I repeat once again, the biggest demonstration of contemporary Russia's history, were organized most of all on social networks. In 2011, 2012, it was, I would say, the start, the beginning of the era of social networks. In Russia, VKontakte, the Russian social network, was very popular. I mean, more than even today, because it was uncontrolled. And these demonstrations organized via social networks were completely uncontrollable by the power, because the Russian power and the security organs did not have any clue, any insights inside these social networks in order to identify, for example, the organizers of the demonstrations, etc. And this is the moment when the Russian regime understood that internet was not only a matter of geeks and startup entrepreneurs, but it was also a matter of survival for the regime. And since 2011 and 2012, the Russian government tried very hard to control the internet by controlling all the platforms. For example, VK was the property of its creator, Pavel Durov, who was evicted from the company because he refused to cooperate with the FSB. And after that, he fled Russia and created Telegram. But also another event did help the Russian government in its quest of controlling the internet, and this event was the Snowden case, when Edward Snowden in 2013 did reveal the fact that the NSA, the American NSA, was holding an impressive program of digital surveillance. Okay. And all these events, the fact that internet was a danger for the stability of the regime, the fact that the Russians perceived internet as a Western invention and a threat to the stability of the regime, confirmed by the fact that by the Snowden revelations for them. I mean, trying here to be in the head of of Vladimir Putin, I would say. All these facts did bring to a very important control on the network, and a lot of law were passed during the last 10 years in order to tighten this control. And the most spectacular of these law was passed 3 years ago in 2019. It was dubbed the sovereign RUNET law. RUNET is the Russian segment, the Russian-speaking segment of the internet, and this law do allow the government to cut the country from the rest of the internet. Of course, for now, it's not possible for many technical reasons, and I don't have time here to explain why, because Russia has one of the most complex networks in the world, at least at the lower level, at the BGP level. But for now, it's not possible. But the possibility exists, and the law encourage entrepreneurs and tech companies to go in that direction. And even if Russia is not able to cut itself from the rest of the world without disturbing its own network, maybe one day it will be. We don't know. But maybe that's not the most important. The most important is that this law and the voluntarism of the Russian government gave to the authorities the technical means to filtrate the network. And now we see the results of this filtration policy since February 2022, so since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian government did close absolutely every independent media in the country and did block the websites of every independent media in the country. And what is an independent media? It's a media that do not rely the official narratives. And all these websites are blocked, filtrated. Western social networks are either blocked or throttled, like Twitter, for example. And so what do you have left? The Russian platforms and all this Runet, which is now under the control of the regime or of oligarchs very close to the regime. For example, a billionaire named Alisher Usmanov, who is under sanction now, is one of the biggest tech tycoon involved in this big enterprise of controlling the Runet. And we don't know where it will go. But now we know that the Russian internet is slowly decoupling itself, separating itself from the rest of the internet. And this is a very worrying thing because we don't know where it will end and where it will stop. Okay, maybe it will stop by cutting almost every free connections between Russia and the Western world. We don't know. Now there are still some ways, of course, for circumventing controls, official digital controls, and etc. etc. You can still use VPNs, but for how many times? The new DPI, deep packet inspection technologies that the Russians are developing, if they manage to do what they want to do, even most of the VPNs will be useless. And when we will be at this level, we will have a huge problem because Russia has one of the most complex networks in the world. And if they manage to control this network completely, it will mean that they will be able to sell this technology to anyone. And it will be the end of the internet as we know it, because they will be able to sell the sufficient technology to separate some parts of the internet, or at least to filtrate it at such a level that almost everybody will have to comply. Because, that's science fiction for the moment, and I hope it will remain science fiction. But that's the path on which Russia is engaged now, and Iran too, for example.
So I did notice that at one point you were saying Russian internet, and then you said Russian-speaking internet.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between the two, between the internet handled by the state of Russia, and there are other people that are not Russian that speak Russian, but is there more commonalities between the two?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I said the Russian-speaking internet because the way we do identify areas of influence on the internet is mostly based on language used for communicating. So there is a French-speaking language internet and Russian-speaking internet. In the case of the Russian language, the Russian language is deeply political and geopolitical, and we see it now because Russia, as pretending to be the how could you say that? Putin's Russia pretend to be to have inherited the power and the legitimacy of the Soviet Union and the Russian Tsarist Empire. And the Russian language in such a context, in the context of the Soviet or Russian Empire, was the common language that was used to harness this huge space where tens or hundreds of different people with their own language, own culture, sometimes own religions did live. Okay, and this is also a matter of geopolitics. And I said that geopolitics is a matter of harnessing networks, and harnessing networks of communication by harnessing the language was one of the core of the power of the Russian and the Soviet Empire. And speaking Russian was seen, could be seen as something with a political significance. Now, with the war in Ukraine, it's changing. But I would say that when you are in Kazakhstan or in Kyrgyzstan or in Armenia or wherever you want, when you go on the Runet, the Russian-speaking internet, you go on VK, you go on Yandex, and Odnoklassniki, and all these Russian services. Well, you use some Russian platforms based in Russia with servers in Russia and depend and complying with Russian laws, etc., etc. It means that the Russian language is now the common language of the whole post-Soviet space. I mean, if a Kyrgyz want to speak to a Kazakh or to a guy from Azerbaijan, they will probably speak Russian, okay? Because this is the common language they have to understand each other. Rarely they will do it in English, but most of the time they will do it in Russian. And when they want to communicate in Russian, well, most of the time they will use Russian platforms. And they will use Russian systems hosted in Russia under the Russian laws, and especially the Russian laws of digital surveillance. So for the countries, the former Soviet republics, the fact that most of their populations, not for all, of course, but for many post-Soviet, for many former Soviet republics, the fact that wide portions of the population do use Russian to go online is something very important to take into account, because it means that a large portion of your population will use Russian services, Russian intermediation platforms, and that you will be subject to the digital surveillance systems of the Russians. And of course, when you are a country like Armenia or Azerbaijan, it's not something that is only a natural information. I mean, it means that a big part of your digital space, digital economy, rely on the Russians. But as I told you before, the Russians are now closing down many things. They are now trying to tighten that control. So, well, you are not. There is also a question of digital sovereignty for these countries who are dependent on Russia for their platforms and so on.
So, last question, then we'll close with this topic and move on. But do you see a possible outcome from one part, these countries using Russian services and big part of the Russian internet, and on the other hand, the Russian state wanting more and more to, let's say, float away magically and separate itself from the rest of the world internet? What's going to happen to these countries?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. Well, it depends of which country we're talking about. Some of them are already going away. That's the case of Georgia, for example. I'm not even speaking about. I'm not even talking about the Baltic states who went away from Russia a very long time ago, or even Ukraine, who forbid the use of Russian platforms. Maybe it was 2 or 3 years ago, because officially. The Ukrainian government did not want its soldiers to use Vkontakte, for example, while fighting on the front lines in the Donbass. So, but I mean, Russian, whether we like it or not, is a very widely spoken language in Ukraine. So now, of course, people are using more and more Western social networks and intermediation platforms. But there is, for a very long time, there was a very important user capacity of Russian digital platforms. So it depends. The most difficult will probably be for Central Asian countries because they only rely on Russia for their connectivity. I mean, the south of Central Asia is a digital cul-de-sac, as we say in French, because south from Central Asia, what do you have? You have the Pamir, very high mountains with no cables, no roads. You have Afghanistan, not especially a country where you want to build important optic fibers cable. You have Iran, also not especially a country where you can freely move data from one point to one point because it is a deeply controlled internet. So now the only solution for this country is to connect to the north, to Russia. Maybe tomorrow it will change because China wants to build some east-west corridors of digital infrastructures with their program of digital Silk Roads. So maybe we will see some backbones going from China to Turkey, going through Central Asia and the Caspian Sea, and so disenclaving this space. But now it doesn't exist. So now you have some countries who are completely dependent on Russia for their connectivity, for their digital activity. And I was 6 months ago on a field trip in Kyrgyzstan, and I met with local operators. It was in April, so 2 months after the start of the invasion of Ukraine, and a lot of some of the operators told us that they were afraid that Russia at some point would cut them their access to the internet if, for example, they would refuse to send weapons or men to Ukraine. Okay, so of course it did not happen, but the fact that operators, I mean people who are in charge of organizing the network traffic in the country, were afraid of such thing, show that they are aware of their of this weakness and that they are desperately looking for alternatives. And low orbit constellations such as Starlink could be some alternatives for them. Yeah, because yeah.
No, thanks. It's I mean that's a pretty powerful lever, I would assume, to be able to cut entire country's internet just by pulling the plug. So definitely a very interesting situation here. But I did say it was the last question on that topic because we have another one. One is also quite interesting, I believe. Some time ago, you wrote a paper about the entrepreneurs of influence
Oh yeah.
from Russia, and specifically in Africa. So would you start us off and define what is an entrepreneur of influence?
Okay, yeah, that's research I conducted with a colleague from George Washington University, and our purpose was to understand the new activity of Russian actors in French-speaking Africa, especially by investigating their digital footprints. So, especially by using OSINT, we wanted to understand how some actors who are now, some of them are now worldwide superstars like Yevgeny Prigozhin. But back then, when we did this research, it was in 2018, 2019, nobody cared about Yevgeny Prigozhin. And there was a lot of OSINT to do on this guy and on some other guy. And so we wanted to understand how these people arrived in Africa, what they were doing, etc. Because obviously we were not able to do some physical investigation. We could not go to see Mr. Prigozhin and ask him what he was doing. Of course, it was not possible for many reasons. So we investigated Prigozhin's and other Russian people's activity in Africa for almost 2 years. And with all the OSINT we did, with all the analysis we had, we were able to understand some patterns in the behavior of these people. Because as a researcher, what a scientific, what I am interested in is not creating or having a scoop or something. I'm not here as a researcher to do the journalist job, because that's not my job, and we are doing very different job. So when I'm doing OSINT on people, when I was, because I'm not anymore, but when I was doing OSINT on people like Prigozhin, I was not there for investigating like a journalist, but I was there to understand some common patterns and to understand if there is some kind of generality here we could understand. And what we noticed is the fact that most of these Russians who were useful for re-establishing Russian influence in Africa were doing it for making money. And they were not, of course, directly linked to the Russian government. They were indirectly linked, and so that's why we forged this concept of entrepreneur of influence, because we wanted to show how these people do accompany the return to geopolitical comeback of Russia in Africa by making either money or political contacts, or what we call a capital in sociology. So either a political capital, either an economical capital, or either a symbolic capital. And this was a way for us to systematize what we were noticing on the ground. Yeah.
So how do they work? Like, are these people directly employed by the government, or does the Russian government just reap the profits? How does this whole system function now?
When we investigated these people, they were not linked to the government in the way that they were independent. I mean, officially, because they were managing a lot of small companies, security companies, etc., etc. And what we did notice is that the business model of such entrepreneurs in Africa was based on three pillars, I would say. The first one was information influence and information operations. I mean, people like Prigozhin, they have a huge experience in information manipulation, because they started to do it during the demonstrations I told you about in 2011, 2012. This was the very, very beginning of information manipulation sponsored by the Kremlin. Then, next, in 2014, during the Maidan revolution in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the civil war in Ukraine, these people were once again noticed with much more evoluted practices of information manipulation. And in 2016, it was the apotheosis of these people, because they practiced some election meddling during the 2016 US election, and they were officially indicted by the FBI in the Robert Mueller report. So after 2016, these people, Prigozhin and all these people doing information manipulation, were looking for a new place to make money, knowing that USA was not anymore a place to make money, because what happened with the election of Trump considerably raised the awareness of the FBI and of the federal government. So they did go to Africa, where some corrupted regime were very happy to pay people who were claiming themselves that they make Donald Trump elected. Even if, of course, we will never know if Trump was elected because of a Russian information operation. Personally, I think that the American society has other problems than only the Russians to elect Donald Trump, but that's another debate. So they arrived in Africa, and especially in French-speaking Africa, with these offers of information manipulations, offers of manipulation of elections via social networks, etc., etc. So this is the first pillar. The second pillar they have is security management and what we call private military companies, mercenaries. I mean, that's what we call the Wagner Group, which is very famous, was not so famous back then. And Wagner, which is actually not a company, but a bunch of companies claiming to be Wagner. And these companies sold some military protection to very unstable African regime that otherwise would have collapsed, such as, for example, the Central African Republic regime of Faustin Ange Touadéra, who is only controlling Bangui and the surrounding, or the regime of Goïta in Mali. The putschist regime of Goïta in Mali is now existing partially because it is protected by Wagner soldiers and by Wagner mercenaries. So here, this second pillar is a pillar of private military company, and what we would say also, what we will call Praetorianism. That is to say, they just sell some kind of Praetorian guards to some very unstable presidents and governments in Africa. And the third pillar, the most important of all, is the exploitation of natural resources, because organizing information manipulation operations, etc., is interesting politically speaking, but it's not very lucrative. I mean, you can earn a lot of political credit by doing this, but well, it's not the most lucrative activity you can find. So, and the PMC activity is also lucrative, but the real place, the real way for Wagner, Prigozhin, and all these entrepreneurs of influence to make money in Africa was to exploit natural resources. Diamonds in Central African Republic, gold in Sudan, chromite in Madagascar, etc., etc. This is where they just took the money for their enterprises and where they took the money to build a real empire in Russia. I mean, and now we see that Prigozhin is going to a next level of its own path to power, as he opened a demonstration center in St. Petersburg. He is now publicly assuming that he did some election meddling in 2016. Some people, I don't give credits to them for the moment, but some people start to talk about Prigozhin as a possible successor to Vladimir Putin. For the moment, I don't believe it, but the fact that people are talking about it demonstrate that this person is becoming more and more important in the Russian political game, and especially by sending soldiers on the Ukrainian front, where the Russian army is in difficulty. So they send some real cannon fodder, as we can say, and everything is funded and financed by the wealth they extract from Africa. So this is typically what we would say a neo-colonial system. exploitation of resources, I would say stealing of resources in order to finance some geopolitical adventures and political adventures of at thousands of kilometers from there in Ukraine and in Moscow or St. Petersburg.
Okay, so I think now we have a good idea of what entrepreneurs of influence are.
You
hopefully.
can read also the paper, which is
Yes, very good.
much clearer.
Would you like to remind the title for people who want to read it eventually?
Yeah, I mean it's open source paper,
Wonderful.
which is cool because research paper. Most of the time, there are you have to pay a lot of money to access them.
It is
One
indeed a
second.
very interesting system. Yes.
Yeah, well, that's open science is something very interesting. The title is Beyond Hybrid Warfare, a digital exploration of Russia's entrepreneurs of influence. And it was published in the academic journal Post-Soviet Affairs. But I assume we can put the URL somewhere on the
Probably.
podcast, or we'll see.
Okay, so the question is, now that we've defined what entrepreneur of influence is, what was the methodology that you used to track them for your paper? Like, what was the OSINT part?
Well, very obvious thing. And here I must assume that Maltego helped me a lot. Because that's thanks to Maltego I was able to cross all the data and to visualize the networks we were identifying. But basically, we did nothing very astonishing. We just identified some websites we knew were belonging to Prigozhin and other entrepreneurs of influence, and starting from these websites, we did find some IP addresses, all the WHOIS informations, historical WHOIS informations with email addresses, phone numbers, Google ID, Google Analytics number in the pages, and with all this information, we found new websites and new institutions and other companies, etc., etc. And then we were able to draw a map, which is actually in the paper, where we have hundreds of entities. But the most difficult part was to make sense of it. I mean, once you have your network, well, it took some time, but once again, thanks to Maltego, it was faster. But once you have your thing, well, we spent months to make sense of it, to understand actually what we had in front of our eyes, because you have to go very deep in the websites and the databases in order to really understand what you're looking at. And that's something, according to me, very important for people doing OSINT. I'm not pretending to be an OSINT professional or something, because I'm not going very far in my investigations, because I'm not a journalist or a hacker or whatever. But as an academic, I observe these practices of digital investigation, and what I see is that once you have your informations, when you have your footprints, data, etc., the most complicated part is to make sense of it by sticking to the context and not being, I would say, out of the point. Because when you have a set of data, and I think that everybody who tried to do some OSINT has encountered this problem at some point. When you have a data set, well, it's very easy to make this data set say or tell whatever you want it to say. And interpretation from small interpretation mistakes to small interpretation mistakes. You can manipulate it, and even unconsciously. What we call bias of confirmation is something very powerful. We have to fight against when we do some OSINT, and so that's why we spent a lot of time to validate, invalidate, and trying not to be in a confirmation bias, because unconsciously you know that you want to find something, but maybe there is nothing to find. So, but sometimes there is nothing to find, and the harder part is to accept that you lost tens or hundreds of hours, and well, there is nothing to find. But that's okay. I mean, that's how science works. Actually, some people do. I mean, science. It evolves thanks to the success of some, but also thanks to the failures of many. And for OSINT, I think that's the same.
Well, that's a beautiful word, and I will try to remember it when I will spend 5 days and find nothing.
Yeah.
Just eyes glued on my screen to make sense of a data set. So that's definitely a very, very nice, very nice word to conclude this podcast. Do you have anything else to say before I thank you for coming in and speaking?
Well, no. Thank you for the invitation, and yeah, maybe for those who read French, maybe some of people who will listen to me on this podcast understand French. But for those who can understand French, we just published a full number of the French journal Hérodote, which is a very old geopolitical journal in France, existing since the 70s. We just published a full issue on the OSINT, and we plan to publish it in English, but it will be in some months from now. So for those who are interested, you can just check on the internet by typing Hérodote and OSINT for the French speakers out there, and you will find it.
All right, very good. Well, thanks a lot for coming, and thanks a lot for all the information.
Bye.
Bye.